Importantly, need to go to the next slide. There we go. This is based on a book chapter that's coming out soon. It's been in press for quite a while. It's the BRSH Handbook on Research-Informed Education Practice and Policy, edited by Dominic Wise et al. There's quite a substantial 2-volume collection, and it's written in conjunction with my colleague Lizzie Knight in Australia, previously at the Mitchell Institute in Melbourne. So today, as Paul said, we're looking at something that's quite important to PhD researchers, as well as I think relevant to all educational researchers who have an interest in doing qualitative research and doing interviews. So I'm going to be looking at a few things, particularly focusing on the ubiquity and commonness of the research interview that informs a lot of research that happens and a lot of publications that come out. I'm going to present 3 main critiques of research interviews, and mostly focus on the third. The first 2 I'm going to look at quite quickly because they're less my area of interest, but I think they're all quite interrelated and important. So I'm just going to acknowledge those. And part of the problematization here is the view that a lot of published research has poorly or under-analyzed interview data in published outputs and so forth. So my critique here is going to focus on different ways of looking at interview texts. I'm drawing on various strands of literature, including some in the philosophy of social sciences. In particular, I'll draw on philosopher Charles Taylor and bits of Pierre Bourdieu. Also, I'll be touching on aspects of like post-qualitative research. I'll draw on some scholars in that field, although I won't be sort of going down that road too much in this presentation. So one of the main takeaways here is to think about interview data as text and as produced in context. And also I'll draw on some other traditions of textual analysis, some of which exist outside of education as a field of research. So a quick warning, this presentation isn't a how-to guide. It's not follow these steps to analyze your qualitative data. It's not a critique of any particular researchers or any particular publications. And it's not really concerned with providing simple answers about how we do qualitative research. It's more about asking questions. But what it is about is a critique of, I guess, taking for granted research practices that we kind of all get taught in one way or another through methodology textbooks or methodology courses and stuff. Also, as I said before, combining various schools of thought from philosophy to bits of historiography and so forth. So, what's the deal with interviews? As you probably know, research interviews inform so much of education research. It's probably the most common form of data generation that informs the arguments made by education researchers. If you look through peruse any given education journal that's qualitatively based, it's most likely to have interview data in there. And often, as I alluded to a minute ago, what we learn in methodology courses often sort of glosses over some of the more philosophical, epistemological issues related to interviews and data, and generally focusing more on techniques of doing interviews and techniques of analysis. And I know there's at least some PhD students in the room at the moment, some of whom I know. So often students are concerned with, when they're doing their PhD project, how many interviews should I do? Who should I interview? How do I get interviewees to answer the questions that I ask of them? And what's the best coding software to use? But this presentation is taking a step back from that and partially rethinking the assumptions about what interviews are, what they can tell us as researchers, and how we go about doing our research. And so I guess another question is, why does this matter? Interviews are an established form of data generation. Why should we get caught up in thinking about them too much? Well, a number of scholars have written about this in different ways over the years. Most recently, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, Schurig, a noted qualitative researcher and philosopher, has written that to maintain quality in education research, and I guess the social sciences more generally, we need to subject ourselves to constant critique and be attentive to current critiques of our own practices and our own assumptions. And therefore, we should avoid just doing what we've been trained to do. We need to re-examine what we do as researchers and think about why we do that. Other people have written saying that research interviews have become too easy and too obvious things to do. That's the common recourse that doctoral researchers go to for data generation. But it's often very little has been in the literature is about broader issues about, well, what research interviews are trying to do and what they should do. And finally, Atkinson and Silverman wrote nearly 30 years ago that the research interview itself needs to be taken away, decoupled from issues of methodology, and treated as a social context, a social phenomenon in its own right. And I'm going to talk about some of these a bit today, but I'm not going to. I'm going to focus more on how the data are used rather than how interviews are conducted. So one of the common assumptions of interview data that is sort of implicit in a lot of research is that they provide a good way to access the authentic and deep self of the individual being interviewed. That often this phrase is often used by people talking about interviews as research interviews being as windows into the soul, or mirrors of the soul. And so interviews are seen as like the perfect way, or a very good way of seeing looking into the person and seeing what they have to say about their own situation, about a given topic, and so forth. And as an extension of this, there's a epistemic authority granted to interviews and interview data, as this author wrote in relation to the idea of lived experience. If somebody says that something looks blue to them, they're just saying what it is from their perspective. You can't critique that. They're in a position of authority to know what they see. They're considered experts in their own lives in a lot of sense. When we talk to people, especially from disadvantaged backgrounds or from groups who haven't experience marginalization and so forth, say different racial groups, people from working class backgrounds and so forth. There's often a moral impetus to researching these groups, is giving voice to people who have traditionally been voiceless in society. So there's been emancipatory intent with a lot of this research. Our philosopher Thomas, I forget his first name off the top of my head, talks about the idea of moral deference, the idea that we owe people from marginalized backgrounds to socially diminished categories, is what he calls them. We owe them a debt. We we should listen to their experiences and their pains and so forth. And often this sort of giving voice is used to speak back to dominant policy discourses or dominant social discourses. So there's a epistemological and a moral sort of impetus to the idea of doing research, which is sort of where some of my critique comes in. So the three levels of critique that I'm going to address are looking at the context of interviews themselves as social phenomenon in their own right, as cultural context worthy of their own analysis. The second one is about how interview data are represented in transcribed text. And the third one, which is what I'm going to focus on more, is how data are presented in written and published research. So I'll go over the first two quite quickly, but it just sort of provides some sort of background for the rest of the presentation. In distinction to the slide a couple of minutes ago where I talked about interviews as a mirror onto the soul of the participant, there's been some research and scholarship into a critique of the interview that draws attention to the various social contexts in which interview data are produced. And there are number of points that could be made here, and some of them are listed here. For example, there are power relations in interviews. An interviewer has some kind of could be seen as having a superior social position, and the interviewee would sort of might respond to that in certain ways. They might phrase their questions or their answers in certain ways. Might try to make themselves look perhaps more learned than they are, or perhaps they might take a defiant view of a researcher who they don't think should be coming into their community and researching them. We also think about are people in a position to really know what we're asking them? Does what we think we're asking them, is it the same as what they think is being asked of them? And therefore the question comes up that can interviews tell us anything other than what happened in a specific social encounter? And that's probably the more extreme end of this critique, but it's something to bear in mind, and not to think about research interviews as pure pure data, a pure insight into the world of the interviewer. And rather that the interviewee has been treated as having a special epistemic viewpoint where they can know all about their own social life and their own own conduct. And so one articulation of this, and there's been many, but here's just one. When we as researchers ask something of an interviewee, it may not mean what we think it means to them. What a researcher, what the answers that are given, the meaning of that may change over time. And if you ask a person the same questions on a different day or in a different way, they could produce different responses. And even if you use a different interviewer asking the same questions, you might get a different response as well. So it draws attention to the messy social context in which interviews are conducted. Now, the second critique, which I'm going to just gloss over fairly briefly, is that transcripts, as we do interviews, we record them, we often send them off to a company to get them turned into written text. And oftentimes the written transcription kind of results in a flattened account of the research, and particularly when data are used in certain ways, certain contradictions in the interview data or ambiguities are glossed over. What an interviewee says is assumed to be fixed and stable. Let's assume that if you ask them the same questions on a different day, they give the same answers. People are assumed to be rational and coherent in terms of their ability to give their own narratives. Often, non-verbal aspects of interviews are removed. But the ums and ahs, which I'm doing a lot of in this session, tend to get cut out and deemed as being unimportant. But these have been recognised as having meaning in their own right. Things like hesitation, people changing their mind about how they're going to answer a question get often cut out of interview transcripts. And then the words get treated relatively decontextualized, but the meaning of interview transcripts are supposedly unambiguous. And the data of interviews are often removed from the broader day-to-day activities and understandings of people's lives. An interview is only a small glimpse into one thing that happens in that person's life. That person is more than what happens in an interview. Okay, hopefully that set the scene a little bit without laboring the point too much. So even if you put aside these criticisms, I argue there are still issues with how interview data are presented, and we need to think about what interview data are and what interviews can do. Our interview is the meaning of interviewees self-evident? Is it obvious to anyone who would read it? Should we take what interviews say at face value? Should we allow them to speak for themselves? And I'd argue, no, we can't. And so this is part of a broader problem that's been recognised by Martin Habersley and other people, that often the meaning of interview data are treated as self-evident and obvious without any real clear, explicit attempt to explain what that meaning is for the researcher. And so this is the sort of work that I'm talking about, broadly speaking. I'm not, I don't want to focus in on any particular journal article. This is just one almost at random that I looked at, where you can see each of the arrows here is an interview excerpt, often interspersed by 2.5 lines at most of text. And you'll see that 1, 2, 3, at least 3 paragraphs, maybe 4, talk about, say, others said this, others said this, others said this. But in a way, this is kind of what's expected in a lot of research. It's sort of standard practice. It's always it's a convention that is often that if it isn't presented in this form, journal editors might question what the paper is doing or the worth of that paper. And so here are just some other examples. I've removed all the names and author details and stuff. But when interview data is sort of listed as dot points, for example, this is the sort of work that I'm talking about. It also exists in a more subtle form, but these are probably the more obvious examples. So these use of interviews here might be characterized as being verbatim or reportage, simple reporting of what people say, often taken out of context of what else they said in that moment, but also taken out of the context of the interview and of their lives more broadly. And as I said before, they're often taken at face value and as unproblematic glimpses into the minds and souls of the participants, and represent brute data, that is a pure form of data that represents reality. In these examples, there's often little explicit engagement with theory or analysis. I see, as a scholar and as an editor of a journal, I see papers that say, have an interview quote, and they say, this shows that, or this is evidence of, but then don't go on to explain the ways in which that quote shows what is being claimed, or shows or supports the argument of the paper. These the meanings of the interview data are often treated as obvious and clear to the reader, and often rely on common sense understandings of the social world. That is, sort of non-theoretical, non-scholarly understandings of the social world. So the reader is often left to do the interpretive work of the author, and or to place faith that the author has done this interpretive work, or more cynically suspect that no analytical work has actually been done. So coming back to the point about common sense understandings of things, often what makes data intuitively intelligible to us as people are our own pre-existing assumptions of the social world, our own moral frameworks, our own values and outlooks and so forth. And so without making these things clear, or using a strong analytical or theoretical framework, there's often the risk of imposing our own habitus on data, that is, our own implicit understandings of the social world. Clegg and Stevenson here are drawing from Bourdieu, and often that can run the risk of reproducing doxa, or reproducing practical knowledge of the world, common sense understandings of the social world. But it's important to realize that things only have meaning in context. Meaning isn't free floating. It's only in the context of certain social rules that things have significance or are intelligible. And here I draw on a couple of older works, including Charles Taylor's idea that meaning is for a subject. Meaning isn't just a free floating thing that exists independent of how we understand things. And so this draws us into sort of schools of thought that have existed for 50 years or more about language and the uses and purposes of language. And there are different ways of articulating this, but in here I'm drawing attention to what's been called the linguistic turn in the social sciences and humanities, where scholars like Barthes, Saussure, and Derrida, for example, emphasize the role of language in constructing meaning. That is, language doesn't just reflect meaning, doesn't reflect the world, it helps to constitute the world. So part of this linguistic turn is a decoupling of language from an inherent and underlying self-evident meaning. I'm thinking about how linguists and literary theorists think about signs and signifiers, and how languages and reality are not one and the same thing. And so the important thing to draw out about this is that text and text analogues, which can be thought of as interview data, ethnographic data, field notes, focus groups, observations, and so forth, can be read in almost an endless number of ways. Interpretation is a key here. The meaning of things isn't given. And I guess this flows on from the idea of the death of the author, that the supposed intent of an author of a text is no more valid than the meaning brought to a text by anyone who reads that text. For example, a novel. Anyone who reads a novel can bring their own meaning and understanding to it. That doesn't necessarily have to be the same as the author's meaning of that book. And so again, we think about language and text not simply as a mirror on the world, but as language as ways of partially constructing and constituting the world. And so therefore, interview data can be read in multiple ways. Okay. Now I turn to a bit of a empirical example. Just briefly, this is a Australian Research Council project that's finished now, but it was a few years ago. It was looking at bachelor degrees offered by vocational institutions in Australia, which is a small part of the higher education market. It caught the curiosity of myself and other researchers as to why people are choosing to go to these institutions. Excuse me. Why would what we thought of as traditional higher education students, why would they go to vocational institutions when they could go to a university and get the same qualification or a similar qualification? So here I'm going to just use one quote and one quote only from these interviews. So this person from a particular vocational institution, their rationalization was they don't like the textbook approach to learning that you get at university. They prefer to be more hands-on. They prefer things to be more practical, and that's better for them in the long run. And a number of other people in these interviews said very similar things. But importantly, what they were saying seemed to ape or mirror or confirm the rhetoric and the discourse of the institutions themselves, the marketing rhetoric in particular about what these institutions have to offer. So another important thing was these interviews were group interviews. So there was perhaps also an issue of whether these students were egging each other on a bit implicitly to sort of, and reinforcing their own, each other's viewpoint about these things. So we were a little bit confounded by what these people were saying. We didn't know what really, whether we should write off these data as unusable or think about them in other respects. And myself and others have gone around to conference presentations and given presentations about this using an odd amalgam of theories to try to rationalize or explain what these students were saying. But we still found that as problematic. So we wondered, are these rationalizations for going to these vocational institutions, are they retrospective rationalizations? Are they what some people have called adaptive preferences or sour grapes? Or were they just aping the rhetoric of the institution? Were they spurred on by their friends in the interview context? So get to the nub of the presentation. What is the problem with taking these data on data in general at face value? Now here I'm drawing from Charles Taylor's notion of incorrigibility. He was talking about not education research, not interviews in as such, but he was talking about cross-cultural understanding and the idea of how people understand their own lives and how scholars might understand them as well. His idea of incorrigibility is that how people understand their own lives can't be criticized, as I indicated towards the earlier part of the presentation, the epistemic authority given to first-person accounts. And Taylor sort of explores these issues about incorrigibility is a good way of perhaps not imposing our own worldviews, our own perhaps ethnocentric or otherwise discriminatory worldviews on what people have to say about themselves. And of course, it's tied to the idea of the authentic self, with deep interiors who produce their own meaning, and also related to the idea that interview data can produce unmediated access to reality. So Taylor critiques incorrigibility on the grounds that it doesn't actually tell us much. What people tell about themselves could be confused or misinformed or have contradictory purposes, and what they say about themselves might reflect this. Just basically just re-describing what people say about themselves, it may have the outcome of casting no light at all on what's going on in terms of trying to understand things in a broader sense rather than just what a particular person thinks about themselves. This critique of incorrigibility has interpretive and philosophical critiques, one of which I just mentioned before about Taylor. And similarly, mentioned before about the idea of just reproducing doxa, reproducing common sense worlds of the view, reproducing common sense worldviews. Now here, Bourdieu has a lot to say as well, actually, along with his counterpart, Quant. They would describe this as an unreconstructed phenomenology of social life, or mere accounts of accounts, and which don't take into account the wider social structures, wider social context, which enable these first-person accounts to be produced in the first place. And there are other methodological implications that I hinted to before about the interview itself. So an alternative, perhaps going to the opposite extreme of taking data at face value, is perhaps taking what a traditional critical theory approach would be to view how people understand themselves as systematically irrational or essentially flawed, that they are blind to their own exploitation in social life. Various political and social theorists have talked about this over the decades, that including those in critical theory in a broad church of theorists that focus on the ways in which people become subject to social ideologies and engage in systematically irrational behavior that thwarts their own lives. And this basically talks to the idea that people can't really talk about their own lives because they don't know what's happening. They're really victims of false consciousness, or their view of the world is veiled by ideological mystifications. So one example of this is the idea of sour grapes. I won't go over this too long because time is at a premium. The idea of sour grapes here, the philosopher, political theorist John Elster wrote about sour grapes, drawing from Aesop's fables about the fox who desired some grapes but realized they couldn't reach the grapes, and therefore they didn't want them anyway, and they were sour, so it didn't matter. And so this might be some way of imposing a theoretical framing to sort of override social agents' understanding of their own world. Adaptive preferences also form some of the basis for the capabilities approach, which some of you may or be familiar with. So adaptive preferences as a form of sour grapes sort of emphasize things that are formed outside of one's control of an awareness, as Nussbaum talked about. So again, the emphasis on broader, impersonal, social structural forces that shape our lives in ways that we don't appreciate. So here I'm sort of stumbling slowly towards some kind of a conclusion. The argument that I'm making here is that interviewees' words are important. They can provide very interesting things for us to look at and think about. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it in the first place. And various scholars have said that it is absolutely essential that we need to look at interviewees and concepts of their own worlds. Without looking at these, our account of the world can be quite lacking. But it's important to not just simply ventriloquize, that is, puppet or ape what research participants say. We need to do more than just giving them a platform or a voice. Hammersley writes the importance of having a skeptical attitude towards data, not in the sense of thinking that they are liars or deceptive, but being aware of things like the context in which interview data are produced, the limitations on interviewees' accounts, both philosophically and methodologically. Interviewees often the quality of interviews often rely on how articulate a given person is. They may not be able to articulate their thoughts very well. They may not remember things well. They may be putting on some sort of performance in an interview, whether they realize it or not. And they may not understand the broader social context in which they work. We also need to be aware of the decontextualization of transcription and coding practices. Coding is another issue altogether that I won't get into today, but it's really related to this. So we need to bring in analytical strategies and theoretical approaches that try to decouple common sense understandings of the world from intuitive reading, from decouple common sense understandings of the world from what the theorist says, us, the scholar, as the theorist. What anthropologists have termed an epistemology of estrangement, or what others have said put the call out to working with and against data. So very quickly, there are the social sciences and humanities have long been aware of a lot of these things that I've talked about, the linguistic turn, the contested meaning of texts and so forth, historiography, even non-postmodernist historiographers have been well aware that the intentions of the author can't just be read off data. Social anthropology looks at gets at the more in-depth context behind people's lives through ethnography. The literary approaches to education research that uses narrative analysis, data as scripted drama, and so forth. There are conversational analysis approaches that look much more detailed at what interview transcripts including non-verbal aspects. Here, Daniel Lamb is one of our colleagues here at Glasgow who writes in this area. Critical discourse analysis is quite a common thing as well, which looks beyond surface meanings of text, takes into account production or power relations that are involved in the production of texts. So finally, as I say, interviewees' words are important. How they view the world is important, but it in themselves is not enough. We need to make our own interpretations of data explicit, whether that's drawing on various branches of theory. I'm being sort of agnostic here in terms of what types of theory you might want to draw on here, as I know there are different traditions. The context of interviews are important to be aware of as well. And being aware that interviewing is a messy, socially situated practice, and it's not just a technical exercise of uncovering truths, reporting data or findings. And fundamentally, drawing on some post-structuralist work here, but I don't think this is particularly a radical idea, but us as researchers need to challenge the assumption that interview data represent reality, and that the words have independent meaning that exist outside of what the researcher is interested in. And so from this, there are very important implications for how we as researchers, scholars, students, future scholars and so forth, how we think about what we do as research, how we think about interviews, what we hope to achieve by doing interviews, how we analyze data, how we write things up and so forth. And a lot of these are related to questions of ontology and epistemology, as much as, if not more so, than they are related to issues of data collection techniques. So I'll leave you with that thought. So thank you very much for your time and your attention. I think I've probably gone slightly over time, but thank you very much.